Okay, welcome to today's webinar and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carol Reese and I'm a registered nurse and a nursing advisor in the practice team here at the SRNA. My role today is to help facilitate the webinar. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that this presentation is being held on Aboriginal land and recognize the strength, resilience, and capacity of the Treaty 4 and Métis people on this land. Our topic today is trauma-informed care, and our guest presenter is Dr. Holly Graham from the University of Saskatchewan. Before we get started, I have a couple of notes on how you can engage throughout the presentation. As a viewer of this webinar, you'll be able to hear and see the presentation. Only panelists will be able to speak throughout the presentation. If you have a question, please add them to the chat section. We'll be monitoring this area for questions throughout the webinar, and these questions will be answered either live or via typed response. If you wish to send your question anonymously, just check the box at the bottom of the Q&A screen. We will be recording this webinar and it may be posted on the SRNA website for those who are not able to make today to view later. An email will be sent to you with a link for the evaluation. We hope that you take a couple of minutes to complete this quick survey. And now that we have the housekeeping items out of the way, I will turn the microphone over to Dr. Graham.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. And I have to say, I'm always grateful for the opportunity to speak to my peers. I love speaking to nursing students. I'm in a faculty at college. But I love speaking to my peers, nursing in general. So today I was asked to talk about trauma-informed care. So I spent some time thinking about the title. I cannot take credit for heart. The nose of art, but nursing really is about the art and science and that. But I did come up with the kind of the conscience and whatnot. And that is very relevant for what we're talking about today, because we're talking about trauma-informed care. And what does that mean? As soon as we have care in there, automatically we're talking about the heart. We're talking about bringing who we are into. I'm just looking at, how does this advance? Oh, there we go. So this was the session description that was circulated. I'm certainly going to talk about the content in here, but it's not necessarily going to be in this order. So a little bit about the foundations of trauma, how common is it? Really, we're interested in the impact it has on the body, but more important, what does that mean for us in the practice and in the workplace? And then, of course, we all want strategies to improve our practice. And that is essentially what we call praxis. How do we apply it? So we're hearing a lot about trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed care. And really, I think what happens theoretically is as practitioners, as we're hearing this concept, but really some of the ideas in terms of the information is how do we put it into practice? And most importantly, why is it so important in that? So really, I want to hear your questions and about your concerns, and you can start sending them in at any time so that we make sure that they're not just left at the end. And I really want you to think about, when I'm doing this presentation, who are your clients and what are their challenges? So a bit of the background I'm going to give in terms of a real fundamental push of why we should all practice trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practice, is because of the population in Canada. And it doesn't just extend to Canada, but internationally as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diverse childhood experiences, a bit about the history of Indigenous peoples with colonization in Canada, and of course, trauma. And fundamentally, when we're talking about trauma, it's equally important to understand resilience, because it's both ends of the spectrum when we look at healing. And we have to have clearly in our mind a picture of the path, where we're going, what are we trying to do? So that's really what I hope to talk to you today about, is how do we walk this path with our clients? And really, what do we need to know to start walking this path in a good way? And ultimately, where are we trying to go? So there's a little bit about your personal healing journey, which is equally important. And very little about the truth and reconciliation calls to action, but I did include the content in here because I want you to have some reference. There's a lot of information, a lot of slides, but I think the most important thing is that you have something to go back to, at least a baseline to start this path. I always situate myself before I do a presentation so that the audience, you can understand where I come from. I am a band member of Thunchal First Nation. That's the community I'm from. My mother was in the residential school as my family, all on my mother's side. And I show this picture for a couple of reasons. So it's my mother, myself, and my daughter. because the face of Indigenous peoples is actually changing. And we tend to make assumptions when we look at people about who they are, perhaps what their life has been. So we see someone with a cane, a white cane, we know they're visually impaired. So we make some assumptions. And it's really critical when we're looking at trauma-informed practice and care, or basically when we're providing care for anyone, that we're not making assumptions because we don't know. This is my daughter. So if you were to see her on the street, you'd have no idea that her mother was in the residential school, that she has been impacted by this legacy because it's affected my mother, which affected my childhood, and certainly affected my children's childhood. So for those of you who are parents, you ever had a nightmare about your child growing up and running away and joining the circus? Well, it happened to me. She belongs to Atlantic Cirque out east. She went up to Dal and did her degree there. She's fluent in 3 languages, English, German, and French. And then also in the family, it's a kind of a bit of an interesting thing is when she pours champagne upside down at corporate functions, she makes $200 every 20 minutes, which is more than I make. So anyways, and then this was her doing a performance in one of the islands over there from helium balloons. So each one of those balloons will hold 200 pounds, just so you know, because I was thinking, I was asking those questions myself. But when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, the face is changing. And this becomes really critical because we don't often know who comes into our care, what their background is, what their experiences have been. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about the history and the historical experiences that Indigenous peoples have had in Canada. Now, demographically, it's about 5% of the population within Indigenous, including First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. But you look at the demographics within Saskatchewan, this is changing. Closer to 20%, and those will be much higher in 2025, much closer to like 40%. So our demographics in Saskatchewan are changing, and that actually needs to be reflected in our practice and our knowledge. Of course, my most loyal companions, my 4-legged friends, great support. So as we talk about self-care, that's something I'd like you to think about, is what in your life fuels your fire. We call it Iskito, fire in Cree, and that's your spirit and your energy. What fuels your fire? Now, I've shared a couple things with you, my dogs, my family, and there's other things in my life. I want to share this definition of wellness. It comes from the Preventing and Managing Chronic Disease and First Nation Communities Guidance Framework. They talk about wellness as a lifestyle approach that adds the element of spirit to the body and mind. And it's about an attitude that you have. And it's basically making actions towards striving towards balance and whatnot. Personally, this resonates with me, but I want you to think about, from your perspective, what does wellness mean to you or not? When we're talking about trauma, equally important, as I mentioned, is to talk about resilience. We hear this word a lot, and really it's about being able to, I don't like the word bounce back because it makes it sound like it's so easy, but when we've had tragedy or adverse events in our lives, it's about the ability to get back into the routine of what we were doing before and really getting back to enjoying life. And so the great news is that, you know, it's not like a hereditary factor that you have or you don't, is that it's something that everyone can learn because it's really about behaviors and thoughts and actions. So anyone can learn this, and that's the really great news. So we can all have an impact with improving our own resilience and improving resilience of people around us. And I wanted to start this presentation with talking about factors in resilience because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is, you know, not so happy. And I want to talk about the history in Canada and how people have been treated in our country. But it's important that we are empowered as healthcare providers of what can I do? What can you do that will make a difference? And what's really interesting in the research, and this comes from the American Psychological Association, is the number one is relationships. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, you know, in the nursing field. We know how important that relationship is. But the primary factor is caring, supportive relationships inside your family and outside your family. So if a person doesn't have this inside their family, this is where we come in as healthcare providers, because we can provide these caring and supportive relationships in our interactions with clients. And these relations are important, that they create love and trust, that there's positive role modeling, and really encouragement. And all these things that, you know, we all have those days when someone gives us a pat on the back or says, you know what, you're doing good, just keep going, you know, and those types of things. That's what helps us get through. But it's also about making plans. You know, we have a goal, we make a plan, and knowing how to achieve that, taking those steps. Self-esteem, feeling good about ourselves, And skills in communication, this really means just being able to ask for what you want, you know, in a way that is respectful and doesn't harm or damage your relationships. And the last one, the capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses. So sometimes what I've done, even in my family, and sometimes when I'm doing workshops, I'll have people go through this and rate each one out of 10. What's your resilience? And it really clearly shows us where we kind of have areas that we really shine and areas that we can really work on in that. So the last one is capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this at the end of the presentation, because this is really important, because emotions have a role in our life, despite the fact that sometimes they're so raw and so intense and overwhelming. And if we haven't had, you know, healthy role modeling, it can be overwhelming, and we would not have been taught how to process them in a way that's helpful versus hurtful in that. So we look at developing any programming or any type of interventions that are really going to make a difference. Anything that fosters or supports these factors in resilience is a step in a positive direction in that. So it's just an easy, simple framework and whatnot. We do have to talk about the past because it impacts the present. And as a psychologist, I have private practice on the weekends, so I specialize in trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've been working in this area for about 11 years. And so I obviously deal with the past. When people come in and do trauma work with me, because my experience growing up on and off reserve is that the past does very much have an imprint on who we are. And there are some things that happen that have to be processed in a way. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means so that they can be resolved, integrated into our central nervous system in a way that becomes adaptive. So the past does matter. And I do want to say a little bit about triggers, because we're talking about trauma-informed care. You can't talk about trauma-informed care without talking about trauma. And I'm not a particular fan of the word triggers, but this is what most people are familiar with and use. So when someone has a trigger, they see something, they have a smell that comes, or someone says something, and they have this reaction, and it takes them back to a past negative experience. So what I always tell people is this is your body's signal that healing is required. And so I always emphasize and facilitate the experience that your body is actually your best friend. And what happens with trauma, and when people have adverse events after a while, sometimes what happens is there can be this disconnection, a real disconnection from self, because it's so intense. But when we have these triggers, it's reminders of, I have some work to do in this issue. So right away, I'm looking at processing this completely different than being afraid or avoiding, but looking at this is information. If you think of your body, it is a sensory system. We have our 5 senses. We're continuously getting information from our environment and whatnot. And emotionals is our response to our environment. So if we were to look at it from from an information gathering system, and looking at that, we have choices in how we respond. And when we can't choose how to respond, when it's automatic, then that tells me there's trauma, and then that requires a different type of intervention. I'm not going to go through each one of these different types of trauma. This comes from the Trauma-Informed Practice Guide, the one that I have the link in here that I'm actually going to talk about, the 4 principles that we really want to integrate into our care. So it just goes through everything from kind of a one-time trauma to natural disasters to developmental trauma. But really, trauma is anything that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So for a little 2-year-old or 3-year-old, the first time they fall down and they scratch their knee and they have blood, that's the greatest trauma they've experienced to date, and that's traumatic for them. And so it's important to know that it has a different threshold for everyone based on developmental, their age, past experiences, and all those things that come into resilience. But when a person is unable to cope, that's when we look at something being traumatic. Doesn't mean they can't heal from it, but that's initially the response. So I wanted to start a little bit, and I'm hoping that most of you at some point have come across adverse childhood experiences, but really this is the longest longitudinal study that has been done in North America. Dr. Folletti did this study. He actually had an obesity clinic, and he found that clients who were actually doing really well in losing weight actually dropped out of his program. And so he thought, why is this happening? They're being successful, and yet they're not coming back. So he actually went and did some interviews on that, and he found a common theme of adverse childhood experiences. So he started thinking about the link about the health and everything going, and he went back and took about 5 years to develop this survey, and then it was distributed through Kaiser Permanente health. And what was really interesting about this population was it's 17,000, was done in California, and a primarily Caucasian middle upper class participant pool. And what they did and what he found is that the more an individual has, the greater number and exposure they have to adverse childhood experiences, that they're actually sequelae impact on their health and wellness. So really he was looking at these 10 areas, different types of abuse, neglect, and then also looking at what you witness as a child, looking at intimate partner violence, and was there substance misuse, divorce. 50% of probably Canadians or North Americans have divorce in their family, and that's considered a 1 out of 10. So you can do your own ACE score in your head, and I have included the actual ones in here. So you can go through this and think about this, and for every one that you score, it adds. So, and this is before your 18th birthday. What I think is most stunning when I look at this as a nurse, I mean, I graduated from nursing in 1985 is when I became an RN. And I think about how long we've had this information. So we've actually known for a very long time that there is this link between these early adverse childhood experiences and later in terms of the health issues that an individual goes on to develop. But this also provides a foundation when we look at trauma, and also provides a foundation of why we want to always practice trauma-informed care and practice, not just with Indigenous peoples or immigrants, but with everyone. Because remember, the study was based on primarily middle-class Caucasian participant pool. What they found is adverse child experiences are actually common. 28% reported physical abuse and 21% sexual abuse. That's 1 in 5. And the cluster, 40% had more than 2, and 12.5% had more than 4. So there's this dose-response relationship problems. And this is what's really, that we have to sit up and pay attention to, right? So there's this stunning link. So we're not looking just at chronic conditions, physical conditions, but we're also looking at social, emotional problems. So when we look at, for example, the Indigenous population, you see these high rates of heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, whatnot. So whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, there's this link between these early childhood adverse experiences and the development. Problem is at 4. Once you have a 4 out of 10, that's when the person has to really take note. Now, what I look at this is, sometimes people look at this and they just say, oh my gosh, like my score is 8 out of 10, like I'm doomed and gloom. And really what we're looking at is genetics is the gun and lifestyle is the trigger. So what that means, and understanding epigenetics and influencing the environment, is we have the opportunity to modify what can happen. So if I know I'm at higher risk, then that means I pay closer attention to my lifestyle. And if I know that these events have happened in my childhood, then I have to look at a path for healing, because healing is the antidote for trauma, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. It's not just doom and gloom, because many individuals have had unbelievable personal circumstance and situations and circumstances, and they have healed and moved on because they found something that worked for them, and the healing journey is different for everyone. But if you look at this, so as the ACE score increases, the increased risk of chronic pulmonary lung disease increases 390%, depression 460%, attempted suicide, look at that rate. And we look at our rates of suicide in terms of what's happening in our province and with the youth. So this is another way to look at this, is just the earlier experiences that trauma has. And of course, when you look at a lot of the work by Dr. Bruce Perry, he's a neurodevelopment child psychiatrist who is world renowned for his work in trauma. And he's talked about the impact it has too, because neurodevelopmentally it changes and impacts the brain structure, right? But with neuroplasticity, we also know that we can actually do things that can improve that. So from the Canadian perspective, 76% of Canadians have had some type of trauma. 9.2 meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is higher than what the average is in the DSM-5. Estimated 50% of all Canadian women and 33% of men have survived at least one incidence of sexual or physical abuse. So our Canadian population has been traumatized, just in general. So it is critical that we keep this in the back of our minds, because one of the great concerns, and when we look at, say, a nursing intervention, is we don't want to re-traumatize anyone. So that's really our goal of understanding people have had different experiences and how it may have impacted them and how that has affected their relationships and how they see people, perhaps how they feel safe. And I, as a healthcare professional, do not want to re-traumatize or add to that already daily burden that that individual carries across. I really liked Nadine's, it's a really good YouTube. We're not going to watch it, but she really talks about the impact on children as a pediatrician and whatnot. So she really talks about physicians having this responsibility that they need to assess for it, they need to screen, assess, and then they need to do interventions. She talks about her program where they actually have an intervention where they meet with the family, they visit with them, and they start to recognize when they see these signs of adverse childhood early experiences, that they actually start the intervention and talking about it. We're not really there. We're not there yet in Saskatchewan. So when you look at the past of all peoples, so we've talked about the ACE, we've talked about the Canadian, and those stats, there's some variation depending on where you go. If you look at the Indigenous peoples, then it becomes even more complicated because of the history. And it's important we understand how this history impacts the relationships today, because the whole experience that Indigenous peoples have had with colonizations is still happening all over the world. It's not over. It's not done. And that's why we have to talk about colonization. We have to talk about the truth. The truth is the first part of reconciliation, because if we don't know, we're more likely to repeat history. So it's really important that we actually have an accurate account of this history, and that we don't perpetuate negative stereotypes and the victim blaming and that. And also because of how we interact now with our clients, we can certainly impact the future of all our clients. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking specifically about this. I think that Carol, I watched her, she did a great job with her presentation with an overview of the residential schools and then the truth and reconciliation. But there are a couple comments I want to make here. Colonization, if you remember two words, it's about disconnection. So they look at healing and wellness, it's about connection. So if you're wondering if what you're doing and making the difference, if there's an aspect of your programming that facilitates or enables connection to self, to identity, those types of things, it is a step in the right direction. And anything that's about disconnection would be perpetuating past colonial processes and whatnot. So it's really important that we keep this in the back of our mind. Epidemics are not often talked about, but they're really important when we look at the history, because that was the beginning of social disorganization. So Indigenous peoples used to travel in tribes. And what happened was, once they started to recognize the signs and symptoms of being infected with one of the, the plague, smallpox, whatever, they started to disband. So they would leave their tribes. So you had completely autonomous, independent tribes of Indigenous peoples traveling, and they slowly would start to lose parts of the tribe. So if they lost their healer or they lost several of their hunters, you could start to see how this whole social structure would change. And they had these complete independent structures that they had their own educational, social, political, they had everything. They were autonomous. That all changed, because when you look at the demographic collapse, like if you were to close your eyes for 5 seconds, imagine 9 of your relatives in a room. So we're sitting at a table here. Imagine 9 of your relatives sitting with you. They just died. How would that change your life? Remember, we went back to the first in terms of resilience. The number one factor are our relationships. So that was really the beginning of the intergenerational trauma, grief, loss that we talk about, was it really started with this demographic collapse. And it's often missed and not talked about, but as we know, it was intentional. Infected blankets were distributed to Indigenous peoples, and it was intentional. And some of them, there's accounts, Indian agents actually wrote that when they survived the smallpox, it was so virulent that their faces were very scarred. And when they looked in the water, you could see how they looked. They committed suicide because they had lost their family, and they saw how they looked. And it was just, for some, too much. I can't even imagine what that would be like, losing 9 of my family members. And I don't know how anyone could cope with that. And when we look at coping, being able to go back to culture, being able to do what you normally do to get through stress is what gets us through, right? If you think about Christmas time, what you do, I know I've developed these routines with my children that we always did, and it feels good, right? It feels like Christmas, or things we do. But if you were to transplant you or me, say, to another country where it's totally different, and those of you who've spent Christmas in other countries, you know, what's that like? It may be fine by choice if you go, but sometimes it's, I miss what I do at home. So there's this whole disruption of coping strategies, this disruption of family connection, family support, cultural, use cultural leaders, traditional leaders also passed in this. So it's really important that we think about that, because that really was the beginning of the social disorganization. And then the residential schools. If you haven't watched We Were Children, I strongly suggest that you do. I usually, one of the classes I teach, it's an introductory, one of our first year classes in College of Nursing. I have the students watch it, and then we talk about it in class and do some work on it. Sometimes reading about content and hearing about content is very different than when we actually watch it. And watching a movie actually, I think, sometimes has greater capacity for people to have develop empathy and to understand what it may have been like. You can never understand what someone's experience is until you've actually went through it yourself. And so that's why I say begin to understand. I'm a parent, I have 2 children. I couldn't imagine my children being taken away and what that would do to me in terms of my wellness and how I would see myself in this world. And that, so just something to think about. Carol mentioned the blanket exercise, the Kairos blanket exercise, and that's an experiential approach to help people understand, perhaps experience a bit of what it might have been like, this whole colonization relationship, and some of what Indigenous peoples have endured and continue to endure. It's not over, many challenges that they face. So I'm not really sure if we're going to get this running here. So just the residential school, just it's just really the beginning of the self-esteem being impacted in a very negative way. This is kind of weird. And the Indian Act was how it was actually enforced. So I want to just kind of move on. We've heard a lot about different ways that Indigenous peoples have responded with historic trauma, the intergenerational trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and of course the increased mental health and physical health challenges. And I just wanted you to have a definition of historic trauma: unremitting personal and collective trauma due to demographic collapse, resulting from early influenza and smallpox epidemics and other infectious diseases, conquest, warfare, slavery, colonization, proselytization that means to force one religion onto another, famine and starvation, ending with the last residential school closing in the 1960s. And so there's been no doubt that there's been a history of trauma. And as a result, people have had unresolved grief. And when you look at it intergenerationally, what it just means is, if I'm unable to resolve my trauma and my grief, I'm going to pass it on to my child. So it just keeps being passed forward. It's like a knapsack that keeps going forward. And this is when we look at healing intergenerationally and having to address their own trauma. So, and it happens as a result because the person doesn't have the support, they don't have the opportunity to actually, or it's not safe to actually take the time to heal. Definition. I want to draw to your attention, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, and just using the disorder really pathologizes when in fact it's a normal response to an abnormal environment. And these 2 authors talk about in the literature that perhaps we call it post-traumatic stress response, that we wouldn't be pathologizing the same way. Perhaps we would cultivate more empathy. I just included this as a link. Often people wonder what's the difference between complex post-traumatic stress disorder versus PTSD. And Dr. Tracy is a psychiatrist, and this is a very good YouTube. It's not very long. Internalized depression, this is when actually people start to believe the stereotypes that they're told about themselves. And then when they believe this, then we look at self-fulfilling prophecy, we look at how that impacts how people see themselves in terms of how they see opportunities for themselves as well. this is a huge issue in today's world right now, internalized depression, people growing up feeling less than. I always talk about the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. They've got great resources if you really want to read and get into it, understand the history. One of their publications is Historic Trauma. It has a very in-depth account of what happened with the epidemics in residential schools. The present. So we talked about the past and why the past is important, and the present. So with Indigenous peoples, they do not have the same health and wellness as non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. And if you're to take any condition, whether it's cardiovascular, diabetes, or mental health, you multiply it 3 to 5 times. And with suicide, it's 11 times higher with Inuit. So they do not have the same level of health and wellness as the rest of Canadians. And I want you to think about how this impacts you as a healthcare provider. What does this mean? You know, how does this impact you in the workplace? How does it impact the work, the care that you provide and whatnot? And I liked this little quote because we look at statistics, but when we really look at it, it's really about creating a culture of accountability and recognizing when human rights are being violated and whatnot. So it's just a consideration to take in. So the present, truth and reconciliation, I just added some resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I wish I could see you in person, but the greatest challenge we have as healthcare providers is really about trust. It's creating a relationship, first of all, and it is going to be challenging because there's this mistrust that's going to come to the table even before you enter the room or I enter the room. And part of that's from history, it's from residential schools and experiences in institutional settings. But it's also, there's a history in healthcare. Now, if you haven't read these, Medicine Unbundled and Separate Beds, I suggest that you maybe read into it, and it would help kind of understand. So many of the children, they didn't get medical attention. They didn't see anyone. They had teeth removed with pliers. I've actually seen clients who are old enough, they were in the TB sanitariums here in Fort Capel, and it's nothing less than horrific and traumatic. How they obtained sputum samples, you know, what they did to children to get that. And unbelievable. I've done trauma work with people who have been exposed to that. Students talk about children dying in their arms, and there's other things that I'm just not going to share, but unpalatable, absolutely unpalatable what these children went through. Electric chair, you know, electric currents from hand crank generators running through their bodies, and just things that, you know, we think about, like, how could this happen in humanity? Humanity, first part's human. What does it mean to be human, right? Connection is important. If we're not connected to our heart as well as our mind, these atrocities, you know. So these are just some examples of some of the things that happened. Children being crippled, children being humiliated, and if they couldn't get a response, then them getting the other children to kind of come in and call me, which is any way to break the spirit. And this is really interesting when we talk about medicine unbundled. I'm just going to read this. It's not unlikely that many characteristics such as shiftlessness, indolence, improvidence, and inertia, so long regarded as inherent or hereditary traits in the Indian race, may be at the root, be really the manifestations of malnutrition. Furthermore, it's a high probability that their great susceptibility to many diseases, paramount among which is tuberculosis, may be directly attributable to their high degree of malnutrition arising from lack of proper foods. So there's, and I know from my mother being in the residential school and talking with her about what she ate, she actually never went to school. She was always cooking and cleaning and whatnot. So we know that there were very low levels of education among the people who were running the residential schools, but many Indigenous students didn't even make it inside the classroom to actually obtain any type of education. And we had a segregated Indian hospital, which just closed in 1996. And there were approximately 20 in Canada. So the apprehension of sick Indigenous peoples was made legal by the Indian Act because we had not achieved status of being a person. So we could be quarantined or incarcerated at the whim of doctors, Indian agents, or government officials. So declaring individuals who are Indigenous as contagious was also a good means of control. experiments, nutritional experiments, and that was actually published. They actually published deliberate starvation, and families didn't know what was happening. They were published by the Canadian Medical Association, first released in 2000. So when we look at this history, I think it becomes easier for us to understand as healthcare providers why Indigenous peoples don't have this trusting relationship, why they just don't come to us when there's an issue. And Duran is an Indigenous psychologist from the States, and he says this mistrust is actually resilience. Because if they continue to trust, what would that say? You know, given the history, we'd actually say, hey, this is a sign of resilience, because they're stopping and checking to say, please explain this to me. I'm not sure if I understand this, right? So just more information there. How hospitals operated at half the cost of provincial hospitals. And this is very similar to our current existing education. The province funds almost twice as much for students in schools in the city and half the amount per child in First Nation communities. So Indigenous peoples are still living with these structural inequities that continue. So the quality of education is already half them in terms of the amount of money provided into, and this is still occurring today. And that's why I'm talking about it, because it is the present and it's what's happening. And so when we look at these health disparities, we have to understand everything that's contributing. It's just a picture. Here's some information. I'm not going to talk about this at all, but I just wanted you to have some resources. And I really want you to think about, and I hope Carol's webinar really started stimulating a thought of what does it mean to you? What's your role in it? The Indian Horse is another that you can watch. It's based on the true story of a young Indigenous man who had great hockey talent. So healing, what does that mean? Everyone needs to heal. People who've been oppressed and those people who have oppressed. All Canadians require healing, and I think that that's something I really think is important to clarify. It's not just Indigenous people to have to heal. People who can do this to another people require healing in that. So as Canadians, we all have a part to play in this healing, in this reconciliation, and whatnot. Determinants of health, we know that the inequities and healing will be addressing those. These are specific to Indigenous specific determinants of health, and the one I want to draw your attention to is just racism and discrimination, because that is something that does come up when individuals are accessing healthcare concern that has happened, and to know that that really does color people's experiences when they're going to health and having negative experiences. So really with Indigenous peoples, people need to have a good understanding of the history so they have an informed perspective. You really have to do that. And it's part of our competencies as a registered nurse to do this self-reflective practice and really looking at to my role and my understanding of how I can contribute in a positive way. Interpersonal communication is so important, how we do it. Are we good communicators? Do we have that art, right? Do we take the time to learn that art? And when we're tired, how good are we at that art, right? SRNA has our core competencies, our guiding principles, and really we're talking about successful and respectful relationships. So healing, and this is important because as healthcare providers, we're all human, right? Every one of us, we have our own histories as well. And when we're looking at healing as a country, as a nation, we also have to assess our own level of healing. How much healing have I done? I've done my trauma work. I went and did specific trauma work about 20 years ago with a somatic-based therapy, EMDR, and that's actually why I became a psychologist, because it was so profound and had such a life-changing experience for myself. But really, personal healing is individual, different for everyone, but we all have levels of wellness that we can improve. And so I just want to say it's really important that we understand that. I just included here because sometimes people ask me, when do I get help? When should I go talk to someone? And so sometimes people don't really feel comfortable asking it, but I just wanted to have that there for your information. So the body response, what happens in the body when we're under threat? So this is a saber-toothed tiger chasing the caveman, right? So a lot of what we talk about is helping this caveman cope. Let's help him sleep better. Let's get him to go to yoga and do some meditation and do some mindfulness so he can come out and run faster from the saber-toothed tiger. So that's part of what I'm talking about today, but I'm also talking about the saber-toothed tiger. We have to change the saber-toothed tiger. That's our policies and institutions, the way things are set up, our inequities, right? So we can't just focus on the caveman because eventually he's not going to be able to run. He's going to be too old, right? So just having that balanced perspective when we look at challenges and issues today, and that's why I'm talking about all Canadians and our responsibility. What happens? We have the fight, flight response, freeze response. And so the first guy, he's running. So this was designed to help us survive. And initially, in the terms of where we've evolved from physically, when we were under physical danger, the fight, flight response. Do I stay and fight? Do I run? But this can be activated by anything that threatens our survival. It could come from an emotional perspective, psychological perspective. And this system, the hypopituitary adrenal axis, your stress response system, was designed to come on when it's required and then to shut off. The problem is when we look at ACEs and we look at when people are being continually traumatized, is it's not shutting off. That's the problem. So short term, blood pressure, respiratory rate, all those things, blood sugar increases because it's getting us ready to help fight, right? Our digestive system is shut off. Our immune system, all those things slow down. So if you think about, if you're always in this state, you're going to have gastrointestinal issues and your immune system's compromised. You also are not in a state for learning because the blood does not stay in the frontal cortex because it's into survival mode for the large muscles in your body. So your hippocampus, all in learning, not going to work. So if you have children coming to school who are experiencing trauma or even being bullied at school, there's no trauma in the home, that has that potential. So this is, I took somatic experience doing the training for 2 years, and this actually came from Dr. Peter Levine's work. So he said, like a healthy central nervous system is a gentle wave, but when we have trauma, it's up with anxiety, hyperactivity, the startle reflex, the hypervigilance is on, hostility, rage. And when it's down, the other way, once we have depression, lethargy, you can't get out of bed, all those things, very flat affect. You have people going back and forth. Those are all signs and symptoms of undischarged traumatic stress. Skayer did some work in this. Hans Seeley was the first who actually worked with stress adaptation, and he did studies with rats and looked at prolonged stress, and he was actually the first to talk about the impact of stress, increased glucocorticoids that were released. Seeley is another physician, so there's many studies now that substantiate that what happens is that there is this very complex endocrine response that happens, and when sustained, it can cause actually disease in the body and organ damage. So really resulting diseases of stress from the prolonged glucocorticoid administration, they reflect that. Diabetes, hypertension, ulcers, all those things I've talked about. So there's enough literature that supports the impact of the past, really does impact our health and wellness. And so the future depends on the present and what we do. So I'm going to go through this here. We still have 12 minutes and then there's questions. This is a Canadian trauma-informed practice, and I've reviewed many, and some of them have a lot more steps. I like things that are simple, that are direct, because they're more easy to implement and more likely to actually be utilized. And trauma-informed practice is just understanding that there's a lot of trauma out there, and people all respond differently. And really what we want to do to prevent re-traumatization or further traumatization is about creating a safe environment, and that they have as much choice as possible and as much control as possible. And there's 4 steps to it. So the first and foremost is trauma awareness. People have to understand that there is trauma and the impact it has, and we've done a bit of conversation about that. And to understand that there often is this relationship with substance use as well, or misuse with past traumatic experiences. So that sometimes when we see someone, they may admit to us or come to our attention because of a substance use. And then with further relationship talking assessment, we may find out that there's more in the background. So just know that these often go together comorbidity. Emphasis on safety and trustworthiness. This is really important because when people have been traumatized, that sense of feeling safe is something that they don't have. It's something that other people often take for granted. If you're used to feeling safe, you grew up in a nurturing environment, it's just how you feel. People have been traumatized, they don't feel that way. And that's something really important to take into consideration, because as RNs, we have this power because it's our institution, we know everything is, we have the power, we have the knowledge, we have the charts, we have access to the physicians and whatnot. So right there is a power differential. And sometimes when people are coming into our emergency departments or they've been hospitalized, they may be coming from unsafe relationships. Because when we look at the statistics in Canada, the home is still the most dangerous place because of intimate partner violence in Canada. So when people are coming into our departments, we have no idea what their home situation is. So it's really important that we are clear, that we are respectable, you know, that we are welcoming. I used to nurse in the north, and I always did the prenatal program because I just loved working with women when they're expecting. And we'd schedule them 30 minutes apart, and we'd have one afternoon every day, every week. And I would have women. So when they came in, sometimes they were late, sometimes they weren't. And they would come in, and I would say, "Hi, how are you? So nice to see you. Come on in." They could be 10 minutes late, and we walk in, but they've got 4 children. I'm still getting paid whether they're late, whether they're early, whether they're on time. And my job really is about engagement and to share the knowledge that we've all spent so many years training. If we don't have the art, that means the ability to connect with people, all the science and knowledge we have in our head is actually not going to value or be of value to them because we can't translate it. So this is about knowledge translation. We look at research. So I can have all this wonderful knowledge in my head, but if I can't connect with this person, they're not going to be able to hear it. So that's where the art comes in. And the heart, the title of the presentation today, is this is a really big part of it. I never ever chastised anyone for being late when I was running those clinics. And it was about relationship. And so, and the thing about it too is if I said I was going to do something, I always followed through. When I did psych nursing and I said psych smoke breaks were at a certain time, I made sure the smoke breaks happened at those certain time, pending a disaster or something happening. But I would come back and say, this has happened, smoke breaks being set back 20 minutes, and goodbye. That may seem like a really simple little thing to you, but when someone's been traumatized and they've been deceived and they've been lied to on numerous occasions, all we have is our word, and that has the most value. So you can do this in your own way, the art of how you nurse. How are you going to engage in relationships with people that create safety? Remembering, I am ultimately not responsible if someone chooses to follow my advice or whatnot. That's their choice. I am responsible for giving that information, and I am responsible for engaging in a way with the best intentions that they can hear it. And we all know what that's like when people tell us how to change this, change that. It's very easy. We all fix everyone's life, right? No problem. But when it comes to, we all know when people tell us how to fix our lives, we don't listen with that same passion, right? It's not the same. Opportunity for choice, collaboration, connection. So this is what I've been talking about. It's just really let people have the choice. If someone comes in, they have a heart attack. They may have 7 to 8 lifestyle changes they have to make. That's overwhelming. It may be helpful to say, out of this list, which 2 or which 3 do you want to work on first? Because if they walk out and don't address any of them, we know they're going to come back. And so it's breaking it down and saying, what do you want to work on first? And personally, I mean, I can't change 8 things at once in my life. And I always remember that when I'm asking and talking with people about making change. So it's really about how do we engage them. And this is the part where it comes in that we have to role model. We have to be able to role model and manage our own emotions so that when people are coming to us, they're in crisis or a disaster has just happened, or they just had an incredible loss, or they're afraid that they have an injured child, that we can role model in terms of being calm, being polite, and listening to them. Because when they're in that activated stress response, remember the HPA axis is activated, they can't reason the same way that you and I can. Because they're activated, their whole body's on threat response. So that's why we need to understand what happens when people are experiencing trauma when they come in, why they don't seem to be rational, and we need to stay calm. Because if we start matching their tone, then it's just going to escalate. So we have to be able to role model calming and centered and staying present. And our ability to do this hinges on our own wellness. If we have trauma and say we're triggered by a particular piece that comes in because it's similar or we've had a similar loss and we haven't resolved or done enough work on it, that can trigger us. So this is where it comes down to, if my healing path does intersect and it impacts, hopefully positively most of the time with our clients, but if it isn't, then that's where I need to sit back and think about what can I do we really need to know as practitioners that we're supported to do this, and we have to know what triggers in terms of burnout and vicarious trauma. All those things come back to self-care, understanding our own boundaries, and understanding when we're triggered by something that's happened to people, then that's just my body telling me I need some work with this. So these are just some ideas of how we can start doing this and implement it in our workplace. An example I wanted to share is Indigenous graduation rates are abysmal. Our goal in Saskatchewan by 2020 is we want 85% to graduate. Right now, 74.8 graduate, but First Nations and Métis 37.4%. The reason I share this is every time I talk to Indigenous youth, I always say, so what are you going to do when you finish grade 12? The reason I do that is I'm sharing with them, I believe, first of all, they have the capacity to finish grade 12, and I believe they have a future in doing whatever they want to do. That's one way to talk to someone that's trauma informed in terms of being respectful and engaging, asking them what they want to do. But I'm also showing a sense that I believe that they have a future. If we had more time, I'd tell you why I do that. So it goes back to when I was a kid. I also want to say we've been talking about trauma-informed care and practice, but really there is a movement of healing-centered engagement. I don't know if you've heard this or familiar with this, but sometimes when we talk about trauma-informed care or practice, we just start focusing on trauma, trauma, trauma. And I want you to know that everyone is so much more than their trauma or what has happened to them. And really when we do trauma-informed care and practice is, in my opinion, we're actually hopefully mitigating some of their past experiences, but creating that space and opportunity for people to start feeling like they can actually take time that they need to address their wellness. And as I said, your wellness, it really begins with each and one of us, every one of us. And what's your plan? I have a very regimented self-care plan that I follow. I just want to say emotions have a role and they give us information about our environment. And there's only 3 things we can do is love it, leave it, or change it. That's the plan. So this managing emotions is kind of a mindfulness, positive psychology approach. It's aware, what am I feeling? Give it a name, acknowledge. Research tells us activation will decrease. Accept it, it's okay, I feel angry. My personal plan, love it, leave it, or change it. And then the distraction, walk, read, or whatever we do. The problem is most people go from aware that I feel something really uncomfortable or really intense, and they go to distraction. And then there's no processing that happens in there. No matter what happens to us in life, it could feel like this huge mountain, and it often is. We tend to try to go around it to avoid it, but ultimately with healing, we're going to have to go to the root of that mountain. And that's where we may need professional assistance to do that. We may use culture. If whatever you're doing is working, keep doing it. If you still continue to have symptoms and it's impacting, those I said when to seek help, then I would say add something else. And emotions are key. I know it sounds kind of funny, but you'd be amazed at how many adults really can't articulate how they're feeling. So when I used to work with kids who were in foster care, I'd give them assignments. They go home every day. You come home from school, I want you to share 2 positive emotions and 2 negative emotions with your caregiver, and they post this on their fridge, and they go and point, and they start to learn what they feel, and they talk about what happened and how they felt it, and then the foster parent listens and validates their experience, and then they take them through that whole thing. What are you going to do? I've even given this to adults, and when I'm processing trauma experience, I actually have this in front. I said, well, when you think about that, how do you feel? And they have no words. And part of that is when they start to go into trauma, they lose the ability to think, right? So this may sound like ABC kindergarten stuff, but emotional intelligence, actually, most of us need a lot of work in that area. This is about boundaries, hula hoops, having a really good sense of what we're responsible for. Now we say, I'm responsible for what's inside this hula hoop. That's all I can take responsibility for. I love Brene Brown's stuff. And choosing moment by moment. So I know that was a lot of information, but because you're colleagues, and I know that, a lot of what I'm talking about is not new, but perhaps the way I've brought it together, I hope what I've given you is an understanding of why it's important that we have this understanding of trauma and how we can work in a way that is going to mitigate perhaps people's past experiences and can actually work towards rebuilding positive relationships with their clients. And sometimes why it's so exhausting. It can be exhausting working with individuals who have had these past experiences, because that trust is such a barrier and whatnot. So I don't know if any questions have come in.
Not so far, but if anyone has any questions, please type them in and we'll give them to Dr. Graham and she can give us the answers, we hope.
We'll just leave it.
And I just want to remind everybody that this webinar will be on our website. Tell your friends. I think it's been an excellent one. I've really enjoyed this. And I think it should be shared very widely. So I have a couple of questions myself. Sure. When you're trying to build those trusting relationships, does it take a long time to get to the point where your patients are feeling comfortable with you? They want to share, and they may not share all the details. I've read quite a bit here, but does it take a long time to develop that relationship so that you can help them or they can help themselves?
I think it depends. I think the best way to describe that is, with children, when you meet children and we all do the hi, how are you, how old are you, what grade are you in?
Right.
And then they know when we've lost interest, they just kind of walk away.
Right.
Authentic engagement is, part of it is we're present. And whenever we're authentically present, people know. And they're more likely to trust us. So it's about being able to be present. My goal isn't always for people to tell me things when I'm working in nursing capacity. As a psychologist, even then, I titrate it. I don't want to know all the trauma. We address it piece by piece because nobody could talk about all the trauma at once, right? So it's really about, sometimes it's talking about the white elephant in the room. And sometimes it's as simple as if you start to see someone getting upset, and you could just say, what can I do right now that would help? Making it right here, right now. And they may say, I don't know what's going on and I'm afraid. And as a nurse, we can say, well, this test is being done. We don't know for sure, but this is what we're going to do. So it's really about being in the moment, because in crisis, people can't go to the past. They don't want to talk about the history, but it's being right here. What can I do right now? And it's kind of like, it's different if I say this and I'm at eye level versus I'm having my hand. What can I do to make this better? It sounds, that is not engaging, right? And I think when you work in community health, or you work in the north, or you work in any small setting, you start to know your people in your community. And even emerge, you start to see people who come more frequently than others, and you get to know. And you have an opportunity to establish more long-term relationships. But if it's always focused on them, you're more likely to get to move ahead in this relationship.
Just another question. Have you ever had a situation where somebody has become so stressed that you just absolutely can't manage them or talk to them, or they're just out of control? Have you ever encountered a situation like that? And how would you try to diffuse the situation?
Well, I'll give an extreme example. When I was doing psych nursing in the States, and I was the house supervisor, so I was in charge of the hospital, and it was during the night. I was doing a night shift, and we had a young man who was about 28, 30. He was HIV positive, and he was throwing things in his room. And we were short. We didn't have enough people to do a code yell, which is what we do when we bring the whole team in and to restrain. And so they called me up. So I went and I talked to him, and he lost all therapeutic relationship with staff. Like, he wouldn't talk to them. So I just walked in, and he just looked at me when I walked in. He said, "You're just here to make me take medication, so I'll calm down." And I looked at him and said, "Well, yeah, actually, I've been called because and I can see you're really upset." So I sat down by the door because he's at the other end of the room. And I said, "Tell me what happened. Like, I can see how upset you are." And I said it, like that. Not the authoritarian voice of, you really need to take your medication and this is unacceptable and you're destroying hospital property and you're keeping clients up like it's 2 a.m. in the morning. I just went, "Tell me what happened." And so he just kind of looked at me because I sat down. He knew I intended to stay. I wasn't standing at the door just, watching my watch. And he just said, "Well, I was supposed to have visitors today and they didn't show up." So he started to tell me these different things that had happened. And I just sat and I listened to him. And he just kept looking at me, but I was engaged. You know, when someone's really listening to you versus someone isn't? And he could tell I was listening. And so when I was done, it took about 20 minutes, and he said to me, "You're going to leave as soon as I take the medication." He says, and he says, "Then you've won." And I said, my goal here is to make sure that you're safe. And sometimes when this happens, medication is one of the quickest ways to help people calm down. And I said, "What would you want from me, you know, if you were to take the medication?" He said, "I want you to come back before your shift is over to come and say good morning." I said, "Sure." So he took it. So, you know, we circumvented having to call for additional backup, and he was calmer, and all I did was listen. I wish I could change trauma, and I wish I could, with a magic wand, take away all the pain and suffering. I can't. But what I can do as a human being is when I listen, and I mean listen, not jerrying, warmth, respect, non-judgmental, like actually listening, it changes the whole environment. And he could see that I was listening in there. And so sometimes it's just like, and I mean, ideally, you don't want a situation to get to that point, because I mean, I know what happens. I know what happens at RUH when that happens. Is, you know, U.S. security is brought in and escalates, right? So the whole point is, if I can be present and centered and calm all the time, I'm less likely to escalate that person, because we don't know what's happened. And people all cope differently. Some people have much better self-regulation skills than others. But if you think about professionals, you know, losing it, and we've seen that, and they're educated, they're well-resourced, they have a job, they're not living in poverty, you know, so we have to look at our expectations of people.
And who knows what, you know, a professional's trigger would have been at that point, but I think we're all susceptible to, you know, there's going to be things that are going to push our buttons. I don't think that's unrealistic. So as you say, being able to manage them, and if not being able to manage them, then seeking help. You're
right. We have things that upset us more than others, like with animal cruelty. That really bothers me.
Myself too.
And I had a client who actually disclosed as a psychologist, and I said, "I can't actually work with you. And I can disengage with a client if I can no longer provide impartial care." I said, "So you have two choices. You can get rid of the cat, SPCA, like rehome it, or give it back to its rightful owner. It belonged to a child. But I can't see you because I feel very strongly about animals, and I can refer you." And he says, "I don't want another doctor." So he actually gave the cat back. So it's like, we all have these things that we feel very passionate about. And I think that that's what makes us human. But we also have to understand how we treat people when we're talking about their rights. They don't, if they come into the emergency department and they're having to deal with me as they are in my issues, how am I meeting their health needs? So when it becomes about me all the time, then that's a sign for me to go get some help in there. And I think, I mean, 1 in 5 Canadians have mental health challenges. Is we go see a doctor for a broken bone, why not for a broken heart? Right.
Okay.
Any questions come in?
Nothing's come through, but if anybody has any questions after maybe you go back and view this again, you can certainly send them to practiceadvice@srna.org, and we'd be happy to forward those to Dr. Graham for perhaps some answers, responses, and we could probably put this on our website, and so that we can share it with as many nurses, professionals as we can. So, so thank you so much. Oh, just a sec, I may have lied. Oh, one says thank you for your excellent presentation. So, and I agree.
Well, thank you. It's such a privilege to come and talk to my colleagues, and you know, and I have to say, I don't usually get nervous, but I was really excited to come today and to talk to you all, because you have such a wealth of knowledge and such a capacity, you know, to impact health in a positive way. And I know sometimes when we're so busy and we're working those 12-hour shifts, you're just exhausted. I think we may not feel as empowered as we actually are. And that's what I really hope to take away from today, is that you are so perfectly situated to make such a difference, you know, for clients and people coming to your care. So I just want you to leave you with that, because we're situated perfectly to make a difference in health in Saskatchewan.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Next week, we will not be having a webinar as council is in-house, but November 13th, our webinar will be the RX. Just okay. If you've missed the webinar, you can view it on the SRNA's Vimeo or YouTube channels. And thank you again, Dr. Graham. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Hi.